Hey guys, this is Mitch with FinePoint CGI, and today I'm going to talk to you guys about how to make a dialogue system inside of Godot. So first, we're going to go through the process of planning our dialogue system. Then we're going to jump into Godot. We're going to build out our dialogue system inside of Godot. And then we're going to jump into C# and kind of code the entire thing. Now, this tutorial is going to be a long one, and it's kind of a continuation of this small 2D platformer thing I'm doing, but you guys don't have to watch previous tutorials to do this tutorial, but you will need to do some finagling on your end to make it work with whatever it is you guys are doing. So that's what I have in store for you guys today. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to plan this out. So since we're creating a dialogue system, it's going to require us to actually plan out exactly what we want this dialogue system to do, right? We don't want to just go in and start coding without having a roadmap or an idea of what we want to build. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to map out kind of what we already have. So we have a game manager here, right? So if we remember correctly, we have a game manager here, and that kind of runs our game. And then we have a player controller here. And the player controller talks to the game manager whenever it needs to change game states. So like, for instance, if the user dies or something like that, that's what that's for, right? Well, now we're going to need to create what's called an NPC character, right? So let's go ahead and create our NPC character. So that's going to go ahead and talk to our game manager here as well whenever it changes states. For instance, if the NPC dies and the player gets coins or something like that, or if the player talks to the NPC, the player will say, hey, I'm talking to the NPC, and the NPC will give the game manager its information, right? But also we need the ability to show what dialogue this NPC has. So this NPC needs to give dialogue information to the game manager. So the NPC needs to house this game or this dialogue information. So we need to create what's considered like a model object, right? So that houses all that data. So let's go ahead and create this little sphere here, or this little ellipse here. And we're going to call this NPC dialogue. And I can never spell dialogue. There we go. And we're going to pass that into our NPC character. So now the NPC character has an object that it can pass to our game manager to say, hey, here's the current NPC's information, and here's the current stuff that I'm trying to handle, basically. And we can always extend this dialogue object in the future, like maybe adding in more state management and like a quest system or something like that. But right now we'll just create a small dialogue object, and then we'll extend it in the future. But now that we have this, we need to be able to post stuff out to our interface, which means we're going to need an interface manager, right? So we'll go ahead and put that in. And then we need to handle our dialogue as well. So we're going to go ahead and place in a dialogue manager underneath our interface manager. Awesome. So what's going to happen is our player controller is going to walk up to our NPC character, right? And it's going to say, hey, I need you, or I want to talk to you, right? This is going to pass the dialogue object to the game manager, and it's going to tell, the player controller is going to tell the game manager, hey, I want to talk to the dialogue manager, and I want to talk to this NPC. So then the game manager is going to say, okay, this guy and this guy want to have a conversation. Hey, interface manager, can you pop up a dialogue, right? And the interface manager is going to go, yep, dialogue manager, go ahead and take this dialogue object and show your dialogue options. And then from there, any interaction will go through the dialogue manager. The dialogue manager will handle everything else. So this should allow us to have a fairly extendable system that might be a little overkill, but it's going to make it a lot more stable in the future if we want to expand on this. Let's say we have 5,000 NPCs with, 1,000 different options each. This is going to get big fast. So we want to make sure that we build something that's extendable for the future. So with that being said, let's go ahead and build this thing. All right, so now that we're inside of Godot, what we're going to do is we are going to go ahead and right click on our game manager, add a child node, and we are going to add in a canvas layer. So if we type in canvas, let's see, canvas layer, and then what we're going to do is we need to go ahead and start building upon our little canvas layer here. So what a canvas layer is used for is it is used for like user interfaces and things like that. It's basically your screen that you actually see. So now what we're going to do is we'll right click, add in a child node. We're going to add in a node, and it's going to be, actually I think it's called a control. There we go. We're going to add in a control, and we're going to call this the dialog manager. And we're going to name this canvas here, we're going to call it interface manager as well. So if you remember our diagram here, we have our interface manager and then our dialog manager. And our dialog manager is going to handle all of our dialog elements. So what we'll do is we'll click on our dialog manager. We're going to go to layout, and we are going to do bottom wide, and that will snap us to the bottom here. And then we're going to pull this up something like, I don't know, about here-ish, something pretty large. We'll drag up our little green dots here. And if you don't know what the green dots are, it's for scaling. So you can actually set this up so that your interface will scale based on its relation to these little dots. So if you were to put it up to the top like this, then this would scale relative to how this scales. So it would scale more vertically than it would horizontally because you have some space between your little box here. Generally speaking, I like to keep them like this. It just makes things a little easier. Now, what we're going to do is we are going to right click, add in another child node. We're going to add in a pop-up here. So we'll just go right straight to pop-up. We're going to turn that on right here by clicking on the little eye, and we are going to make that full rect. So if you click layout and go to full rect, that will pop all of this out for you. All right, now that we have that, we want to have some kind of background here, right? So that it actually looks pretty good. So let's go ahead and add a small background element here by putting in a color rect. And we're going to also lay that out as a full rect. And that's going to be a full-sized white box here. So that way we can show up text on here. Now, inside of our pop-up, we're also going to add in a label. And we'll set this up to be something like, I don't know, actually, we'll just take layout and we'll go top wide and we'll pull this down just a tiny bit. Let's pull that little green tick mark down as well. We'll add in some text to our label, and we'll say test NPC name. And you can see that right now, you can barely see it, but it's there. It's kind of white, but you can't really see the text. So let's go ahead and come down here to our custom colors section and change our font color to be black. Now I'm going to pull this out just a tiny bit, and I'm going to pull this down just a tiny bit. So that way it's got a little bit of buffer between the top of the screen and the left side of the screen. So now what we're going to do is we're going to right click, add in another child node. We're going to add a rich text label here. We're going to go ahead and double click that. And we're going to make this full rect as well. And we are going to pull this down till it's just slightly underneath the test name NPC. And the reason why is if we put a bunch of data in here, so let's just throw a bunch of text in here. Let's go ahead and copy and just paste that a few times. Just to throw a bunch of data here. You can see that we wouldn't want it to cover the NPC name, right? We can also see that we have the same issue as we had last time, where the color is not the correct color. So let's go ahead and change that. Custom color, default color, and there we go. Now we're also going to pull this up because we're going to give the user some options to be able to respond to this player, like, you know, hey, thanks, I got your information, right? Or whatever, right? We could say, I'll take the quest, right? If it's a quest NPC. And we're going to pull this over a tiny bit, and we are also going to pull this over a tiny bit just to give it a little bit of buffer room. Now, one of the things that we want to make sure that we turn on is we want to make sure we have scroll active on. And we also want to make sure that we have scroll following on. And what that's going to do is as text rolls in here, it will snap your your little scroll bar down to the bottom. So if you see when I have something like this, right, and there's no scroll bar, it's good, right? But if let's copy this, all of this, right? And if I go ahead and I paste this, you'll see that it's staying at the bottom as the text flows in. And the reason why you want this is that it will allow the user to not have to scroll down to read the rest of the text. It just naturally scrolls down as the text kind of comes in. So perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and just paste in some words so that we have something to look at. And what we're going to do now is we are going to go ahead and add in a horizontal layout object. So it's called an H box container here. So we'll put that underneath our pop-up, and we're going to go ahead and do a bottom wide on it. And we'll pull this up to something like here-ish. Sweet. So now we'll pull this up as well. And there we go. And this will hold on to our selectable dialog elements. So basically all the little selections that the user's going to make, so that way they can make choices, right? Like, oh, yes, I'll accept the quest. So now that we have that, we need to go ahead and make our little selection object here. So we'll go ahead and right-click HBox container. We're going to add in a control node. And we will go ahead and change the size of our control node. So underneath rect here, we're going to go ahead and change our minimum size here to 100x. And that is going to go ahead and allow us to have different selection options. So if when I put text in here, now it'll maintain that 100 size. So now that we have our control, we'll go ahead and right click, add in our child node, and we're going to add in a label. And we will go ahead and make that a right wide on our little control node here. And we'll pull this over to something like that. And I will pull this over to something like that. And then we'll go ahead and put some test text in here. And we're going to need to go ahead and change our color to black so that it works with our white background. And we will align this to left center. And then we're going to right click here and add in a texture. That's a texture button, not a texture. Right click, add texture rect. And then I'm just going to go ahead and kind of size that up so that it works well for us. Great. So now that we have this, let's go ahead and click on this and call this interface selection. And we will right click this and we will save a branch as seen as interface selection. Then we can go ahead and get rid of this. Now that we have one, and like you can see, if we duplicated it, we'd have multiple. So that's perfect. One of the things I don't like so far is this needs to be centered. So let's take our H box and do alignment at center. That way, when the text box shows up, it just kind of shows it in the center. Great. So let's go ahead and delete those. I don't need those anymore, but now we know where everything's at. Now let's go ahead and select our dialog manager. Let's right click, attach a script, call it dialogmanager.cs. So that's perfect. Go ahead and hit create. We're going to do the same thing with interface manager. Right click, attach script, interface manager. That sounds perfect. So let's go ahead and hit create. And so far, there's not going to be much in here. Eventually, it's going to get, we're going to expand it. It's going to be big and it's going to have a lot of stuff in it. But right now, there's not too much that we have to put in here. So let's first get rid of that commented out variables. And let's add in a public static dialog manager. And let's just call it dialog manager. And we're going to say, hey, on ready, go ahead and do dialog manager is equal to get node, and we will say dialog manager. And then we're going to say as dialog manager. Whoops, as a capital D dialog manager. Awesome. So what that's going to do is that's going to give us an external way to call our dialog manager. So like, for instance, if the player needs to call the dialog manager for some reason, like they're trying to talk to somebody, they can say, hey, game manager dot interface manager dot dialog manager dot do whatever it is that I need to do. So now that we have this, we're pretty much done with our interface manager class, at least right now for this tutorial. So we'll go ahead and open up our dialog manager here, and we have quite a bit more coding to do here. So the first thing we need to do is we need to make a method to show our dialog elements. So let's go public void show dialog element. Next, we'll go ahead and pop up our dialog box. So get node pop up, and we are going to say pop up in this case. Dot pop up like that. And what that's going to do is that's going to tell the dialog element to pop up. And then what we're going to do is we will go ahead and write some of our text here. So we're going to say, hey, go ahead and get node rich text label pop up rich text label. We're going to say dot text is equal to test text. And then we're also going to say get node label. And we will grab the label is equal to dot text is equal to test name. And then we are going to say, hey, on ready, show dialog element. So what that should do is if I go back to here and I go ahead and I hit play, is it should pop up our dialog element. Now in this case, it is huge. So what I'm wondering is our dialog pop-up broken? It doesn't look like it. Do I need to, hold on one second. Let's see if I make this full rect and I pull this from being full rect to only being a bottom wide, and I pull this up to something like that. Let's see what that does. See if that fixes our little issue. So let's go ahead and hit play. Now that I made that little adjustment. Awesome. So now you can see it has test name and test text. So our code is working. That's good news. So you can see instead of having test NPC name, we have test name. And instead of having the crazy text there, we have test text. So now we know that our code is working. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to set up our NPC. So what we'll do is we're going to go back to Godot and we're going to go ahead and put together our little NPC character. So what we're going to do is we're going to right click here, add in a child node. We will add a kinematic 2D body. And the reason why I'm choosing a kinematic 2D body is A, it's going to need to be able to use collision, and B, later if I want to make the NPC to walk around or to do different things, it's a good idea to make sure that your character or your NPC can actually move around. So kinematic 2D bodies are great for if you want to move physics objects with code. So what we'll do is we'll right click here, add in a child node, add in a collision shape, and we will make it a square shape. So let's go ahead and grab a rectangle shape, and then we're going to right click, add in a child node, and add in a sprite. Since we don't actually have a sprite here for us to use that we haven't already used here, that's not like an enemy character, what we're going to do is we'll just take the archer hero we have here, and we will right click here and go ahead and open in File Manager. And we'll go ahead and go into our archer hero, and we're going to grab his idle and running state, and we're going to open up Krita and go ahead and drop that in here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to modify his color. So I'm going to go let's see, I believe it's adjust color balance, and I'm just going to grab his midtones and I'll throw him more of like a, I don't know, cyan blue color. Yeah, there we go. So we'll just make him blue and we'll hit OK. And I think that that's good enough that you can kind of see the difference between the guys. And we'll go ahead and save that. And we'll change this to idle running underscore good. So that way he's got something to make him look a little different so we know which one's a good guy and which one's an enemy. So let's go ahead and come in here. It's going to go ahead and throw that in here. And we will take our preset and change that to 2D pixel. We'll re-import this. And we're going to go over to our sprite and grab our texture and throw this in there. Now you'll see that he's got a few things. And actually, you know what I'm going to do is instead of doing a sprite, let's go ahead and get rid of that. And let's add in a animated sprite. And let's go ahead and add in a new sprite frame object. And we'll go ahead and add in sprite frame from a sprite sheet. You guys have probably seen me do this a few times, but that's where the button we got to click. So click that and go ahead and go to Archer Hero, Final, and then idle good. And we'll go ahead and set this to a, let's see, looks like 8 horizontal and 2 vertical. We'll grab these 2 frames and we're just going to call this idle. So that way he has some frames to work with. Now we're once again, like we did originally, let's grab him. We'll lock him right here with our little lock, and we'll drag him over here so we can kind of see how he compares in size to our actual character here. And we'll go ahead and change his scale down to, I don't know, something like this. Let's see. Something about that tall, I think, would be good. And let's go ahead and unconnect these two and drag this back into this little square here. And then we're going to go ahead and make our collision shape about the right size for our character here. Perfect. And now we'll go ahead and relock this, and we're going to name this NPC. And we'll drag him over here so that way he's off on his own. So that way the player can go over there and talk to him without fear of getting attacked or shot at or anything like that. Okay, so now that we have a NPC character, let's go ahead and right-click it, attach a script, and let's just call it npc.cs, and let's go ahead and create that. The first thing that we're going to need to have is we need to go ahead and set up what the NPC is going to say. So the NPC is going to have a state where he's going to say, here's my initial dialogue, here's a couple of selections, and then when you select one, it's going to go ahead and bring up another selection, right? It's going to bring up another piece of dialogue, whether it's okay, thanks, have a good one, and then you can hit okay, right, and close the dialogue box, or it's something like, hey, I need you to go get me an object, right? Like go get me a quest, like a quested object, like a necklace, let's say, right? So what we can do is first we need to create an object to handle or to be that dialogue, if that makes sense. So think of it kind of like instructions on what the person can say. So what we'll do is we'll make a class that is an NPC dialogue class. So it's going to house what the NPC is going to say. So we'll create a new file and we'll say NPC dialogue. And inside of here, I'm just going to grab NPC and I'm going to go ahead and paste this. And we do not need it to inherit from kinematic body. And honestly, we don't need it to have any of that stuff. And we probably don't need that either. So if we go ahead and save, oh, this needs to have CS at the back end here. I didn't add that. So .cs. Awesome. So what we can do with this is we can say, all right, what do we need? Do I already have a, oh, that's because I copied and pasted this. Okay, I was like, what? Let's make sure these match. Because Godot has a small bug where if these don't match, they will not compile properly. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and plan this out a little bit. So let me grab Draw.io here real quick. And you can see we have our little thing here. It says here that we have an NPC character and NPC dialogue object that character holds on to, right? That's kind of what we're creating now. But one of the things that we also kind of need is we need a interface selection object, right? because the dialogue option has things that the user can select, right? So we're going to need a selection object for it to have. So we need to also make this little object here. So let's go ahead and make that little object. So if we minimize this and we go ahead and Control A, Control C, create a new file and call it interface selection object.cs. That's not CS, that's .vs. Rename, .cs. And we'll go ahead and paste this in here. And then we're also going to grab that name there and just paste it up there. So now we have two classes here. The NPC dialog object and the interface selection object. And the NPC dialog object will be holding on to some interface selection objects, right? So what we need to do is we need to first have an index. And the reason why we need an index is because every object that's some form of selection or something like that should have an index to reference to. So those interface selection objects will reference an index to determine the next interface or the next dialogue object that object or that dialogue can pull up, if that makes sense. Next, we'll have a public list of interface selection objects. Oh, come on. Like this, and we will call it, since it's public, it'll be capital. And then we're going to say public list of NPC dialog objects, right? And the reason why, and I will draw this all out for you guys to hopefully better understand this. And then finally, we're going to have our public string, and we're going to call it display text. Awesome. And now I need to add in here using system.collections.generic, and that will allow us to use the lists here that we have. Now, what we also need to do is we need to go to our interface selection object, and we need to go ahead and make that. So if we go over to our interface selection object, it'll have two things. It'll have two strings, or an integer and a string. And we're going to have a selection text and a selection index. So if we go back to our diagram here, let's kind of move over here real quick. So what's going on is the workflow is going to be like this. We pop up a dialog, so we get our NPC dialog. Okay. So it's going to get our NPC dialog, and from there it's going to pull its text. Okay. And then it's going to go ahead and it's going to get our interface selection objects. Okay. So if we draw this across here, then what it's going to do is it's going to go ahead and allow the user to make a selection. So user makes selection. Now, what it's going to do is it's going to say, hey, is our selection index in our NPC dialog indexes? Okay. And if it is going to go ahead and basically do the same thing here. So it's going to go here and it's going to say select our next NPC dialog from our list of dialogues. And we'll pull this up like this, and then this will come back to here and it will pull the text to display, and it'll get our interface, it'll make another selection, and it'll allow the user to make a selection. If it doesn't exist, what it's going to do is it's going to bail us out. So that's the reason why we need the things that we have. So if we look at our interface selection object, it has a selection index. So the index that when it gets selected, that's going to be what it's going to search in our list of objects, and our selection text. So it's going to be the text that displays for the user. And in our NPC dialog, we have a list of our interface selection objects saying, here's the things that we can select. We have a list of our NPC dialogue saying, here's all of our NPC dialogues that are underneath this NPC dialogue. We have our display text, which will get displayed, and our index of this NPC dialogue. So that way it can be found by our selection object. And if that doesn't make sense, go ahead and throw a comment down. I know it's a little confusing, but that's basically the gist of how this is going to operate. So now that we have all of this, let's go back to our NPC here. Let's go ahead and make a private list of, our NPC dialog here. We'll call it NPC dialog because I like original names, and we'll say using system.collections.generic. So that way we can go ahead and grab our little NPC dialog here. So now the first thing that we need to do is we need to go ahead and set up our NPC dialog objects. Now, in a future tutorial, I'm going to go ahead and throw it out into JSON for you guys, and we can actually pull it from JSON and populate our NPC dialog, so that way we can, better manage this. But right now, I'm just going to throw it in the ready. So we're going to say interface selection object obj is equal to a new interface selection object, and we are going to say obj.selection index is equal to 1. obj.selection index or selection text is equal to, we'll say, I don't want the quest. Actually, we'll say I do want the quest. Why not? I like to be adventurous, so then what we're going to do is we'll create another interface selection object. And honestly, now that I'm looking at this, let's go ahead and go into our interface selection object, and let's go ahead and add in a small constructor. So we'll say public interface selection object, and we're going to pass in a int index and a string selection text. And all that's going to do is that is going to say selection text, and it grabbed the wrong one. Selection text is equal to selection text, and then we'll say selection index is equal to index. And that's going to go ahead and just allow us to quickly construct this information. So let's go over here, and instead of us needing to do it like this, we can actually just go 1, comma, and grab our I do not want this quest. Or I do want this quest in this case. There we go. That's going to make things a little easier, and we can just kind of construct it, right? So that way we don't need to go through the process of having multiple ones here. So now we can say interface selection object obj2 is equal to a new interface selection object. We'll make this a 2, comma, I do not want the quest. Whoops. Awesome. And then what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to go ahead and create another one. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to duplicate this. So Control C, and let's go ahead and Control V and Control V. And we'll set this as obj 3 and 4. And we will say selection index will be -1. And we're going to go ahead and say selection index is -1 as well. And we'll say okay and okay. Now, the reason why is because once they say, hey, I do want the quest or I don't want the quest, we want to have those selections available, and we want to be able to have both okays. Actually, I think we could probably just get away with one, to be honest. So now we need to go ahead and create our NPC dialog object. Well, much like what we did with our interface selection object, let's go ahead and create a small constructor just to kind of handle it for us. So let's go over here and say public NPC dialog, and we'll say, hey, I want a list interface selection object, and we'll say interface selection objects, comma, string display text, comma, int index, comma, list, capital L, list of NPC dialog objects. We'll call that dialog, and we're going to go ahead and make that nullable. So, well, by defaulting null. And we'll go ahead and create our braces there. We'll go ahead and assign our variables here. So we'll say interface selection objects is equal to interface selection objects. And then we'll say display text is equal to display text. Oh, and I don't want a capital D here. I want a lowercase d. So let's go ahead and do that. And then we'll say index is equal to index. And then we're going to say, hey, if our dialogs does not equal null, then we're going to say NPC dialogs is equal to dialogs. Now, the reason why we want to make this null is because if we make this null, it allows us to say, hey, this is the end of the chain. You know what I mean? If we can check if it's null, that means that it's at the end of the chain of this whole mess here. So now if we go back to our NPC here, we can go ahead and pass in our NPC dialog object. So let's go ahead and say NPC dialog is equal to a new list of NPC dialog. And let's go ahead and make an object wrapper here. So we're just going to go ahead and kind of throw it all into this little object here. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to say new NPC dialog. And we'll say new list. A new list of interface selection object. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in my obj, comma, obj2. And we're going to pass in our display text that we need. And we'll say, help, I need you to help me. And we need to pass in an index, and we're going to say index of 0. So what we're doing, I know this is kind of a weird little system here, but basically what we're doing is we're creating a new dialog object, we're creating a new list object, and we're passing in our two interface selection objects here. And we are creating what our NPC is going to say here. And this is our index of this speech here, of this dialog object. So when we want to display our text, since this is 0, this is going to be the first one that gets displayed. And if we were to select something and this were to say, for instance, 0, when I select I do not want the quest, it would go to 1, which would go to probably this one. And otherwise it would go to, this would go back to this one. If that makes sense. It's easier to show you than to explain it, but that's kind of the direction we're going. So let's go ahead and hit comma and say, do the exact same thing here. So I'm just going to go ahead and paste this. So we have 3 of them. And we will say, whoops, I have my caps lock on. Thank you so much for your help! Exclamation point. And we're going to make this match this interface selection object here. So we'll say 1. And in my case, I want this to be 2. And then we're going to make this one 2. And for our objects, we're going to make this object 3. And we're going to make this object 3 as well. There we go. And then I'm going to put a semicolon here. Awesome. So I know that this looks kind of crazy, but basically what I did was I created a way for us to be able to simply create dialogue trees using this little method. Basically, you just create your selections here, you point them to your index, and you can see here's our indexes here. And if it's pointed to, like, for instance, 1, when they select this one, it'll take them to this dialogue object. This one is 2, so it's going to go ahead and take them to 2 right here. And this little list here shows us which objects are going to show up. So this one's going to show object 0 and object 1 and object 2, these two objects up here. And this one is going to show object 3, which is basically just okay. Yeah, that's fine. And you can see that this one and this one are going to show the okay, which will terminate our little script here. So now that we have this, we need to be able to display our dialog box. So what we need to do is we need to go ahead and modify our player controller to detect if an NPC is nearby. So let's go ahead and take a look at our player controller here. So we'll go to player.tscn, we'll go to playercontroller.cs, and we'll go ahead and scroll up. We'll say it about here. And we're going to need to come up with a button for the user to use. Now, I think we already have a button that we can use here, but let's go ahead and take a look real quick. Go to project settings, and then go to input map. And I think I'm going to go ahead and use the UI accept button here, the enter key, or in this case, the space key. But I believe I already have a jump, so I'm not sure why I have UI accept as space. Let's go ahead and remove that. I don't think we need that. But it looks like we're going to go ahead and just use the enter key to go ahead and talk to the user here. So let's go ahead and hit close and come to our player controller. So we'll go here and we're going to go ahead and say if input dot is action just pressed UI underscore accept. What we're going to do is we are going to go ahead and get our NPC. So we're going to have to go and find our NPC. So conveniently, if I remember correctly, we have we have left and right raycasts here. So let's go ahead and see what the name of those raycasts are. So if we click on our, whoops, I didn't mean to click on the script. If we click on our player editor, it looks like we have raycast left and raycast right. Is that correct? Yes, it looks like raycast left and raycast right is the ones that we're looking for. So what we'll say is we'll say, hey, if our node, if get node raycast 2D quote left, let's grab left raycast dot is colliding. So it's going to say, hey, if our raycast is colliding, let's go ahead and see if that's an NPC. So node obj is equal to, and we're going to cast that as a node, get node raycast 2D left underscore raycast dot get collider. And what that's going to do is it's going to pull back our little raycast object that we collided with, and we will say, hey, if our obj is of type NPC, then we know that we're colliding with an NPC, and we can actually talk to that NPC. So we'll say NPC is equal to obj as NPC. Awesome. And then we need to go ahead and show our dialog object here. So what we can say is interface manager dot dialog manager dot show. Oh, which one was it? It's show dialog element, right? Yes. All right. So what that's going to do is when we get into the NPC's range, we'll be able to show our dialogue element. And now we'll go ahead and just grab this little bit of code here. And we'll say else if, and we'll pull all of this. And instead, we're going to substitute this for right. And right. Awesome. So now let's go ahead and take a look at this and see if that works. It might work, it might not. Let's see what it does. So, well, first things first, we have our dialogue popping up. So that's not okay. So let's go to our player scene and grab our interface manager and hide our little pop-up dialogue because we don't want that up just yet. Let's go ahead and hit play. And actually, it might just pop up anyway. Yeah, because we have code that is popping it up. So let's go back over to our dialogue manager and let's comment out this. So let's go ahead and get rid of that. Awesome. So now let's go ahead and hit play. And it shouldn't play. So if we run over here, well, first things first. We just crashed. So if I run up there and I hit enter, it crashes. Get node left raycast relative to player not found. So let's see what's going on. Oh, raycast left. Oh my goodness. I'm making all the mistakes today. All right, let's try this again. All right, let's try that one more time. So if I run up there and I hit, I fell off. Awesome. So now you can see it came up, which is good. That's kind of what we wanted. Now, one of the things that we've noticed, is if I try to run my character, you notice that he runs, but like he can't go through the NPC character, right? So that's a big problem. So what we can do is we can go ahead and just have collision for the player, or have the collision for the NPC. But let's go ahead and just throw them on a separate layer. So we'll just throw them over here with our layer and our mask, and then we're going to go ahead and allow our player to have collision here. If I remember correctly, that should work. Let's see if that works. Not quite. Wonder if I need to disable collision here. Let's try that. I might have gotten too far ahead of myself. Let's see. There we go. So now if I hit enter, you'll see that I can't hit it. And the reason why is because they are on different layers. So what I need to do is I need to go to my raycast. And if I go to my player and I go to my raycast here, these two raycasts need to have the second position here on their collision mask. See how that's set differently now? So now if we save that and we run this over here and we run back over there, we should be able to talk to the player or to the NPC. And you can see that we're behind the NPC, and the reason why is because the object that is at the bottom is on top of everything. So if we just drag the player to the bottom, like that, he should be able to get behind the NPC now, or in front of the NPC now. And there we go. Perfect. So now we need to draw this data from the NPC so that way the NPC can show us what he wants to say instead of just saying test name and test text. So what we need to do now is we need to create a small, almost like a setting dialog option inside of our NPC object. So let's go ahead and create a function here. So public void set NPC dialog. And then we'll go ahead and do interface manager dot dialog manager dot NPC. Does it have one of those? It does not. So let's go to our dialog manager, and we'll go ahead and create our NPC dialog object. So we'll say public list of NPC dialog, and we'll say NPC dialog. And we're going to say using system.collections.generic. I can't type generic today. There we go. And that will allow us to call from it from here. So NPC dialog and, oops, not an object, is equal to our NPC dialog. There we go. So what we're doing is, hey, we're going to go set the NPC dialog object from our NPC to our interface manager or to our dialog manager. Now we need to call this. So the player controller is going to need to call this and say, hey, NPC, I want to talk to you. Go tell the dialog manager that you want to have a conversation with me. So we will go here and we'll say npc.set NPC dialog. And then we're going to do the same thing up here. And I know what you guys are probably thinking, because I'm thinking the same thing. This needs to be abstracted, right? There's no reason to have this copied code here, right? So let's go ahead and pull this out. So let's come down here and let's create a, whoops, didn't want to do that. Let's create a private void show NPC dialog. And we'll just have it do that, which is simple enough. And we'll pass in a object. So it looks like it's going to be a node obj. And then if we come back up here, we'll go ahead and just paste show NPC dialog obj. And then we'll do the same thing here. There we go. And that will just keep our code a little bit cleaner and a little bit healthier instead of us just dumping all of our code into an unusable mess. That way, if we want to make a small change, we don't have to do it on both raycasts. We can just do it on one instead of both. So it helps with maintainability. So let's go ahead and save that. And now that we have that, let's go out to our dialog manager. So we can come down into our show dialog elements section here, and we can just go ahead and say NPC dialog, and we'll just go ahead and throw 0 in there, right? And that will allow us, cannot convert to string. Oh yeah, and we're going to need to pass in dot display text. And if we go ahead and we run this to go ahead and test our work, we can come over here once this loads. We can run over here. We can enter. And you can see, help, I need you to help me, right? He's freaking out. He's having a good time, right? So that's perfect. That's what we want, right? It's pulling back the data that we needed. So now that we have that, we need to make this bit of code reusable, right? Because we don't just want to show our dialog element and show the first element, right? We need to be able to make this interactive, right? And changeable. So let's go ahead and throw a new function down here. So let's say public void write, and we'll pass in a NPC dialog, and we'll just call that dialog. Awesome. And I probably spelled dialog wrong. I don't think so. I think I'm good. All right. So we're going to have a public void write dialog, NPC dialog. And we'll go ahead and we'll grab this, Control-C, and we'll paste that in here. And instead, we are going to say it is equal to our dialog.displayText. Great. And now, instead of just passing here, I'm going to take this, and I'm going to put this here, and I'm going to say write dialog. and we'll say NPC dialog, and we're going to go ahead and put 0 in there. So now it's going to pass in our first indexed NPC dialog. So now what we need to do is we need to actually display our selection elements. So as you guys know, we have our interface selection object here, right? As a CS, right? And we have our interface selection scene here, but we also need an object for that interface selection to have, right? We almost need an additional object that holds on to our interface selection object, if that makes sense. So if I open up Godot here and I go to our interface manager, actually, if I just go down here and I go to interface selection, you can see that the interface selection does nothing. It has no scripts attached to it. So let's go ahead and attach a script to it, and let's call it interface selection.cs, which works perfect for us. And we will go ahead and go into that. So the first thing that it needs to do is it needs to know if it's currently selected, right? So public bool, we'll say selected. We're going to go ahead and default that to false. It might already default to false, but let's just go ahead and do that. And we also need to know what interface selection object it currently is. So we need to say public interface selection object, interface selection object. And then we need to say onReady this.get node, and we're going to go ahead and grab our, I'm assuming our label. Let me see what we have. We have a label. Yep. So we're going to go ahead and grab our label. So we'll say label, and then we're going to say label. I believe it's lowercase l. Yes, it is. Awesome. So we'll say label, and we will say dot text is equal to interface selection object dot selection text. And then we should have a way to set our selected. So public void set selected bool selected. And we're going to go ahead and say selected is equal to selected. So now that we're in our dialog manager, what we're first going to do is we're going to say for each var item in dialog dot interface selection objects, and we're going to go ahead and instantiate our object, but we don't actually have an object to instantiate yet. So let's go ahead and go up to our top and do a little export here, and let's say public packed scene interface selectable object, and we will come down here and go ahead and instantiate that object. So we're going to say interface selection is equal to interface selection interface selectable object dot instance as interface selection, and we need to capitalize that I. All right, and that's just going to pass us back an object after it instantiates it, so that way we can work with it. Now next we have to say interface selection dot interface selection object is equal to item, so that way we can go ahead and assign our interface selection object to our item, or I guess our interface selection object, to our item, or our item to our interface selection object, whichever. And then we're going to go ahead and say get node. So we're going to go ahead and get one of our subnodes, and we're going to go ahead and grab pop-up slash, in our case, it is going to be pop-up slash hbox container. We'll make that hbox container, and then we'll add this. My apologies. Dot add child, and we're going to go ahead and add our interface selection here as a child object. And then we need to go ahead and keep track of what selection objects are currently showing. So let's come up here and say public list of interface selection objects. And we will call them selections. And we'll go ahead and instantiate it on startup. So that way it just creates it. We don't have to worry about it exploding anything. And then we'll come down here and we'll say selections.add interface selection. And that's going to go ahead and add that object. And you can see that it says interface selection. Could I convert interface selection to interface selection object? That's because that's my mistake. This should be interface selection. So we can keep track of what we have. There we go. And I don't want any of the objects to be selected. So I want to make sure that they're not selected and that we blow away any previous selections that we've had. So we're going to say interface selection.set selected. And we're going to go ahead and set that to false. So that way, it's no matter what going to be defaulted to false. I know it's already defaulted to false, but I just want to make sure. So now that we have this should instantiate our selection object. So let's go ahead and take a look and see if it does. If I come over here, I hit enter, and we've got a crash, a hard crash too. We go to here, and it says, hey, null reference. Something's null, right? Well, what's null is that we don't actually have an interface selection object to instance. So at least it's getting to this code, which is good, but it's not handling our little null here because our dialog manager here has an empty interface selection object. So we need to go ahead and grab our interface selection scene here and drag that in here. Now, if we go ahead and hit play, we come over here, we jump, enter, and you can see that they're a little bit on the large side. So let's go ahead and either A, expand the size of these, or B, reduce the actual words that we're using. So let's go ahead and say, instead, if we go to NPC and we change this from I do not want the quest to I can't help, and let's do I will help. We'll just make it a little easier, a little smaller words, so that way it's easier to work with. Awesome. So now that we have that, let's go to our dialog manager here and let us go ahead and set our first element as selected. So what we need to do is first we need to go into our interface selection object here. So if I focus in on that, you can see it right here. You can see we have a texture rect here. Right now it's empty. So let's first open up Krita and let's go ahead and add in a new image here. Let's make it 16 by 16, which is about perfect. And let's just kind of draw an arrow. So let's just do something like this. That's not too shabby for my first attempt here. So let's see. I'll probably make it more cursed as I go. There we are. And it's a PNG, so we can actually just pull our background. And now if we go ahead and save this in our Celeste-like tutorial, let's make this a PNG and let's just call this selection cursor. All right, so now what we can do is we can say selection cursor is on our texture rect, and we will go ahead and re-import this as a 2D pixel object. There we go. And we're going to go ahead and make it keep centered, so that way it's centered. And that looks like that'll work perfectly. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and hide it by default, and we will save. So now what we need to do is we need to go into our interface selection object, and when we set our selected, we're going to go ahead and get if our object is selected. What we're going to do is we're going to get node, and we're going to say we're going to call it a texture rect. And we're going to go and get our texture rect here. So it looks like it's literally just texture rect, so that's fine. Dot visible is equal to true. Else, we're going to go ahead and set the same thing to false. So that should, by default, show us no selection objects. If we come up to him and we run up and we hit enter, there will be no selection objects available. You don't see it. But what we can do is we can go into our dialog manager and we can say selections 0 dot set selected true. And now when we run this and it builds, we can come over here and hit enter, and you will see that we have our little selection object here. Awesome. I probably should be black, to be honest with you. I don't think blue works here. So maybe I should go update that to black. I just don't think blue works in this case. So let's go ahead and set that to black. There we go. And now that I'm looking at it, let's just kind of pull this like that. That way it's a little bit nicer. And we'll just go ahead and save that over. So now, if I hit play, it should reload everything. And if I hit here, you'll see we have our black little line here. Perfect. That's exactly what we need. So now that we have that, we need to disable our ability to move. And what I mean by that is if I run up here, if I click on here and I run up here and I hit enter, I can still run. I can still jump. I can still basically do everything that I could if I wasn't in a dialogue, right? So what we need to do is we need to go ahead and make the player stop doing stuff if the dialog box is up. So what we can do is we can go ahead and go into our game manager and make that decision. So remember how the game manager kind of houses everything that's important, right? It houses all of the major components and all of the thing that affects everything in the game, right? So if we wanted to pause the entire game, we could through the game manager, right? So what we can do is if we go ahead and create a Boolean up here, and we'll say, up here we'll say public bool paused is equal to false. And we'll say game paused. All right. And if we come over to our dialog manager and we type game manager dot, you notice that we can't actually access our game manager from here, right? Because it is not a static object. So let's go ahead and use one of my favorite little tricks to make our game manager global. So what we're going to do is inside of our game manager here, what we're going to do is we'll say public static game manager. And we'll say global game manager. Now, I know that there's probably some better way to handle this inside of Godot, but I always like to do things just this way. And if you guys have a better way, just go ahead and tell me. But what I'm going to say is, hey, if global game manager is equal to null, then I'm going to go ahead and say global game manager is equal to this. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I'm literally saying, hey, this is my global game manager. Else, I am going to remove my game manager. That way, I never have two game managers in the project at the same time. They're always just one. A single source of truth. So now, what we can do is we can come up to our dialog manager and we can say game manager dot global game manager dot game paused is equal to true. And now that we're saying that, we can go to our player controller. Oh, let me save my dialog manager. Go to my player controller. If we come up here and we go into our process and we're saying, hey, if health does not equal 0, or game manager.global game manager.game paused does not equal true, then we will allow you to do things. So basically, I am shutting off the ability to do anything inside of the player while the game manager says the game is paused. So if I come over here and I hit play and I hit enter, oh, it didn't seem to work. So let's see why it didn't work. Oh, I see. Or, and. So I need, and. There we go. I've been coding in Python lately, so I've been typing and instead of doing the and. So if we come over here and we hit enter, you'll see that I can no longer interact with my player. Now, you'll notice that our animation's a little weird, so we got to figure that out, but it looks like that will work for us. So let's do a little bit of backwards coding here. So we'll say else we must be paused or dead, right? So we'll play our idle animation. There it is, animated sprite.play idle. So we'll just go ahead and throw that in here. And that should allow us to play our idle animation. Now, the reason why I'm doing it this way, instead of calling something else, yeah, see, there we go. Now it's idling. Is because I don't want the game to completely pause when a dialog box is up. I'd like the enemies to exist and things like that. And I'd like the idle animations to play. So that way the world seems more alive instead of just pausing everything. So now that we've got our selection options running, we have our character not moving, and we have our stuff populating. Now we need to get our selection system to work fully. So that is going to be a whole nother process. So let's go into our script here. Let's go to our dialog manager here, and let's uncomment this little bit of code here. So if we type toggle line comment and we tab this over, that will allow us to go ahead and use our process. So what we're going to do is I'm going to check to see if we're paused. So hey, if game manager dot global game manager dot paused. All right. So if the game is paused, then we're going to allow you to interact with the dialogue. But there's a possibility we might want to pause the game for another reason, right? We might want to pause the game because for like a setting screen or for maybe a power-up screen or something that's not an actual dialogue, right? So what we need to do is we need to create a Boolean up here. So we'll say private bool is dialogue up. And we'll say, hey, we also want this and we want dialogue up. And we're going to come down here to our dialogue object, and we're going to say down here is dialogue up is equal to true. There we are. That way we can go ahead and make sure that we can interact with our dialogue while having more flexibility. So now what we're going to do is we're going to come up here and we're going to say if input dot is action just pressed, and we will say UI underscore left. And what we're going to do is we're going to say if item is for each var item in selections. I believe we have that. Yep. Okay. If item is interface selection, item dot set selected false. So that way, if it's been selected, it is no longer selected. Then what we're going to do is we're going to say, then we need to go ahead and kind of move our cursor to the left, right? So we need to go down our interface selection object, if that makes sense. So we almost need a rolling total of what our current index is. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's say private int current selection index, and we'll just make that equal to 0 by default. And then we'll come down here and we'll say if it's left, current selection index minus equals 1. And then we'll say, hey, if the current selection index is less than or equal to, actually we'll say less than 0, then what we need to do is we need to make current selection index equal to 0. So that way we can't go past our index, if that makes sense, because we only have 0 to whatever, right? So we can't go past what our, we can't go past 0 or else we won't have that index anymore, if that makes sense. So now what we need to do is we need to say selections, and we'll put our current selection index dot set selected, and we will set it to true. So what that's going to do is that's going to go and pull our index of our selections and say, I need that one to be selected. And now what we're going to do is we're going to say else if input dot is action just pressed UI underscore right. And then we're going to say the same, basically the exact same thing. We can pretty much just copy this code here and paste it. And instead we have to say plus, flip our sign. And what we can say is, hey, if it's above our if our selection index is above our selections.count, then we need to make it equal to selections.count minus 1. And the reason why is because the count that we're going to get back is going to be a number from 1 to whatever the count is, but our selection index that we're expecting is supposed to be 0 to whatever. So it's a base 1 versus a base 0. So that's why we are minusing 1 here. And we're going to go ahead and set that selected. So now if we hit save, in theory, providing that we've set up everything correctly, this should work for us moving our little selection icons. So let's go ahead and go here. And you can see if I hit left and right, and we just got a crash, but let's keep checking this out real quick and let's see why it's crashing. But you can see if I go left and right, it seems to be good. But if I hit left twice, it's good. If I hit right twice, it's not good. Why is it not good if I hit right twice? It says, hey, system argument out of range, index was out of range, must be non-negative or less than size of collection. And the reason why that's a problem is because when we increment our selection, okay, it's getting above our selections count. So we need to see why that is. And the reason why is because we need to say, hey, if it's greater than selection count minus 1, which is exactly what we did earlier. Remember, we did that up right here, right? And the reason why is because, again, it's a base 1 versus a base 0. So if we go back and we try that again, we come over here. Now, and no matter how many times I hit right, you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, it's not going to blow up our little selection system. Perfect. That's exactly what we wanted. So now that we have that, now we have to create some magic. And what we need to do is we need to have our element start displaying the next element, if that makes sense. So if we come over to our dialog manager and we say, hey, else if input dot is action just pressed UI underscore accept, because that's our enter key. And we will pull that up like this, and we'll create our little if statement here. We need to create a small function that allows us to display our next dialog element, right? So what we can do is we can come down here and say private void display next dialog element. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass in the index of our selected element. So what that will do is it will allow us to pull back our NPC dialog object. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, if our NPC dialog dot element at or default index, and you'll see that it's upset with us because that doesn't actually exist, but it is totally a thing, right? We are missing an assembly reference, okay? So we need to scroll up to the top, and we need to pull in system.link. And if you don't know what system.link is, it is the best tool that you will ever see in C#. So we'll pull that in. And what this does, providing I spelled it correctly, let's see if I did, dot element at or default. I did. Okay, cool. What that does is it says, hey, pull back an element at this index, or if it's not that, pull back a null object. So that way we can actually check, hey, is this a null object? Did I make a mistake as a coder and not put the correct object in there? Or does that location not exist, right? Or we can say if index is equal to -1. Now I know you're going, what is this all for? Well, the reason why we're doing this is A, we want to make sure that the NPC dialog exists that we're trying to pull back. And B, we're going to see if the index is -1, because -1 means that it's an invalid index. And that means we probably want to close our dialog box. So we're saying, hey, if it's null or if the index is -1, let's go ahead and close our dialog box. What we're going to say is we're going to come up here and we'll create a small private function called shut down dialog. And what it's going to do is it's going to allow me to say get node pop up, and we will say quote, we will say quote pop up dot hide. Great. And then we're going to say game manager dot global game manager dot paused. Game pause is equal to false. And then we're going to go ahead and close our dialog. So dialog is dialog up is equal to false. And then from here we can call that. So shut down dialog. Now, if it's not null or it's not -1, then we can say else. We know that that index is a good index. So let's go ahead and say write dialog and go ahead and pass in our NPC dialog at that index. So what does all this do? Basically, it just lets you go, it lets you select your dialog here. Then it's going to pass that index into here and say, hey, go fetch our NPC dialog at that index. So if you remember, back in our NPC, we have these little dialogs here that say these are the indexes that this dialog object is at. So if I go ahead and I go here, and I come over here, and I play it, and we run over here, and we hit enter, and I say, I will help, you'll notice that nothing seems to happen. See that? But what if I go ahead and I say, let's go up here and say, let's go to here and here. And let's see if there's anything wrong here. So let's go ahead and close Godot. and let's go ahead and run and debug this. Let's see what's going on. So Godot is going to pop up. We're going to run over here. We'll hit enter, and we will pick I will help, I can't help. And it looks like, almost like this isn't getting connected. Let's see. Oh, that's because I didn't code up here. Well, that would be why it's not working. So let's go up here. I totally forgot on this. So we'll say display next dialog element, and we're going to go ahead and pass in our selections selections, and then our current selection index dot our interface selection object dot selection index. And I know that's a huge mouthful, but basically what it's doing is it's going and fetching our selection object at that index. So it's saying, hey, go get our object that we have selected, then go out to that object and pull back its selection index. So now if I close this and I play it without debugging, and let's see if this works. We run over here. Whoops. We run over here. We jump. I will help. Thank you so much for your help. But you've noticed something. I will help. I can't help, and okay. If we hit okay, whoa, what's going on? You know, it's freaking out, right? Why is it freaking out, right? Well, the reason why it's freaking out is because A, we're not deleting our dialogue elements, right? You can see that they're just duplicating. So that's our first problem. So let's take a look at that real quick. So we write our dialogue and we write our interface selection objects. We don't go through and delete our previous selection objects, right? So we need to go ahead and delete those. So what we're going to do is we will say for each item in get node. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and make this a node. Item in get node, and we will say node, because I don't know what it's going to be necessarily. I mean, I have a good idea of what it's going to be, but I'd rather just err on the side of caution. And we'll say here slash pop-up slash, and if I remember correctly, we called it hbox. Yeah, it's right here, hbox container right there. And then we're going to say dot get children. All right. And then we're going to go ahead, and I need a capital N here. We're going to go ahead and query free that. So item dot queue-free. There we go. So that should fix our small bug here where we're going ahead and basically just duplicating objects. So that kind of worked. We got an error here. Cannot dispose of access object, so that's not a great thing. Or cannot access disposed object. So if we come back here, something's blowing up, right? Like, oh no. See, you can see it's cannot access disposed object. Well, what's going on is we're deleting our object when we write our dialogue, but we are not pulling the object out of our selections objects. So let's go ahead and go to our selection objects. So selections is equal to a new interface selection object. So now that we've done that, it should go ahead and delete that list of objects. Basically, think of it kind of like we're still holding on to those selection objects, but they don't exist in Godot's world. So we're trying to access it, and Godot's going, I don't have this object. So now if I select this, perfect. That seems like kind of what we want. But now we've got a system out of range, must be non-negative. And it looks like our interface is not getting deleted properly. As you can see, if we run over here. So that's our first problem. Our second problem is if I hit I can't help and I hit OK, on our left side, it seems to go kaput on us. It kind of blows up our entire program. And let's first deal with our enter key stuff. So first things first, if we play this in editor and we have our 2 breakpoints here, providing that Godot wants to cooperate. Does Godot want to cooperate? Well, I'll be right back since Godot's kind of crashing on me. I'll be right back. All right, so if we run over here, we jump, we hit enter. I will help. You'll see that we have a breakpoint here, so let's take a look. Write NPC dialog, that's what we wanted, so go ahead and run through. Great, hit OK. Shut down dialog, that's exactly what we want. So if we go in, it runs through here, it hides our pop-up, and then it says, is dialog up is false, and then it runs through. But for some reason, it's coming back up. Why is that, right? Well, here's the reason. So we're running through here, we're setting our pause as false, and then later in our script execution, we are executing our player controller here. And our player controller is running through here and saying, hey, I'm going to go through here, I'm going to process my movement. Oh, they pressed enter. And now I'm going to do this little bit of code here. So the NPC dialog just shows back up, right? So what can we do about this? Well, what we can do is we can tell the dialog manager to go ahead and wait until all of the code has been executed and then continue. So what we're going to do is we will come up to the top of our code for our process, and we're going to say, hey, public async override. And what that's going to do is it's going to tell C# to say, hey, run this whole section here off on its own. Go do its own thing. I want you to just go do by yourself and don't let anyone else tell you what to do. Go do your thing, okay? And it's just going to go put it off in its own little space. And then what we're going to say is we're going to say, hey, I want you to await for a signal. Okay, so to signal. We're going to say get tree because we got to tell it what signal we want to wait for. And we are going to await for an idle frame. Now, what is idle frame? Idle frame is the last thing that gets called out before a frame is finished. So all script execution has completed. Everything is done. It broadcasts idle frame, and then this is going to say, hold on a minute, I need to run my stuff real quick. So now if we go over to our Godot game and we run over here and we try it, it should allow us to close our interface object. Perfect. Now we just need to figure out why it's crashing when we hit enter on our object here. So let's see what it's doing. So if we go ahead and debug our project, so we go hit play in editor, and let's see what happens when we attempt to hit OK on our second half. So let's see what it does. We run over here, we hit enter, I can't help. It's going to write a dialogue saying, oh, hey, sorry, you can't, that sucks, please help me. Hit enter. All right, so it does not even get to this section. So that's our first problem. So we know that much now. So now the question is, when we hit enter here, and we'll go here, I guess, what is it kaputting on? So let's go ahead and play in editor. Let's run over here. Let's jump, enter. I can't help. Display next dialogue. We know this one works, so that's okay. Continue. Okay. All right. Now, let's see what's going on. So what is our current selection index? So this. Now, if there's one thing I don't like about C# for Godot is this whole section here is kind of a mess. You got to like work around almost what, what it's looking for. And I can't really hover over this and like, debug like I can in Visual Studio. So I'm assuming that it might be a Visual Studio / Godot issue. But what we can do is we can search for our current selection object. So current selection index is 1. So in selections, if we go find selections, our count is 2. Our count is 1 here. 0. So our index is 1. Our current selection index is 1, but our selections is looking for a 0. So that's what's going on. Do we need to reset our selection index? Let's go ahead and check that out. So if we say on right dialog, selection index, current selection index is equal to 0, and let's see if that go ahead and fix it. So let's kill that. Let's go ahead and come over here. Because it's possible that because we went to our right and we incremented our selection index, if we hit enter, that was what it was. So what was the problem? Okay, well, the problem is we hit over, so we incremented our selection index to 1. We hit enter and our selection index was still 1. And because we did not move our selection index left or right, our selection index was still 1. So by setting it to default to 0, it fixed our problem. This has been quite a journey to build this small little thing, hasn't it? But we are making great progress. Now there's one last little thing that we need to do. And that is we need to set up the ability to see our NPC's name here. Test name is not the correct name of our NPC. Something else is, right? So let's go to our NPC here, and we will come over here and we will go ahead and create a private string, and we're going to say NPC name. And we will go ahead in our constructor here, or in our ready, we're going to say NPC name is equal to Bob, because Bob is the best name. Set NPC dialog. So we're going to come over here and we're going to need to open up our dialog manager here. We go to our dialog manager. We scroll up here. We'll say private string dialog. Actually, it'll be a private public. We'll make it public. Public string dialog header. And we're going to come down here and we are going to set our text to dialog header. There we go. So now the NPC can say here, interface manager dot dialog manager dot dialog header is equal to NPC name. There we go. So now if we come into Godot here, make sure I saved. I did. Save. Yep. If we run over here and we jump and we hit enter, you will see it says Bob now. Help, I need you to help me. I will help you. Thank you so much for your help. I can't help you. Please help me. Perfect. All right, guys. So that's all I have for you guys today. I know it's been a long tutorial, but it's worth it once you get it fully going. So we went through how to set up a small interface manager and dialogue manager. We set up a small NPC conversation system, and we set up a selection system that allows you to run through some NPC prompts. Now, in a future tutorial, we're going to go ahead and save the states of the NPCs and things like that, and pull back more data and stuff like that to make it more dynamic. But right now, at least we have it started. So if you like this video, go ahead and hit that like button. And hey, if you dislike this video, go ahead and hit that dislike button, because I am here to make content for you guys. And this was a viewer request So I do listen to you guys. So if you guys have any ideas for future tutorials, go ahead and throw them in the comments below, and I'll be more than happy to throw them onto my Trello board and make them into future tutorials. Now, the next step for our C# tutorials is going to be doing moving platforms, and then we'll be moving into doing a small camera system. But for now, guys, that's all I have for you today. So thank you so much again for watching, and I will see you all next time. Thanks.